everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. Is that loud enough? Can you guys hear me okay?
Good.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for coming out. I also want to thank Dr. Simpkins for having me and your school for having me out here as well. It's really an honor to be with all of you. So, usually when I start off a presentation, I like to give people a little bit of an idea. First of all, as Dr. Simpkins mentioned, my website, Abandoned America, this is the 10-year anniversary of it. The second book, Abandoned America, Dismantling the Dream, just came out about a month ago. First one, Age of Consequences, was out about 2 years ago now. So let me give you an idea of some of the places that I visited and what their stories are. I've been to quite a few industrial sites. This is a China factory. If you look up there, you can see all of those, kind of dish-looking things, or the forms that they would make the plates and cups and things like that with. They look like they're not that heavy, but they are, which is part of the reason why they're sinking through the floor in that picture. This is a steel mill. At the time that I photographed it, it was cold idled, which means that they were hoping that they would reopen it, but they never did. To give you a sense of scale and perspective, which, by the way, you guys have a great projector, so it's nice to be able to really point that out. This hook is probably about 2 times as big as I am. You can kind of get a little bit of sense of scale from the safety railings there, but I mean, this room is absolutely enormous, and that plant is pretty much gone at this point. That is the Packard plant in Detroit. It is reputed to be the largest abandoned site in North America. This is a lime quarry that is from central Pennsylvania. That was gone when I went back to photograph it, or half gone, I should say. Hershey Chocolate Factory, right there. That was the original one. That was actually a really poignant one for me because my father worked for Hershey Chocolate. I grew up in Hershey for a number of years. So this was kind of like the cornerstone of the town. It didn't exactly close. They opened up a newer facility, but this was the one that Milton Hershey built. And if you were to look on the other side of the wall over there, you would have seen a big pit of rubble where they were tearing down the buildings as it was in there. That is an infrared photograph of an oil refinery, which is why it has those funky colors. This is one of the grain silos in Buffalo. This is LeBeau Brothers Clothing Company. This was in Baltimore. And one of the things that people frequently ask me about is how it is that so many things get left in these places. In this particular case, there were thousands of high-end men's coats that would have been in like Lord & Taylor and Nordstrom's and places like that. Well, to understand why the things are left, and it's different in every place, but with a business like this, what happens is that basically when it goes bankrupt, they lock the doors. Everything in it is considered something that they can potentially sell off to pay off debtors, right? But coats are kind of chump change for a bank, even when they're in good condition like this. These were in great condition, actually, even years and years after the place closed. But if coats were really selling all that well, they wouldn't have gone out of business in the first place, right? This is the Lee Plaza Hotel in Detroit. This is the Fallside Hotel in Niagara Falls. It's one of the chapters in my newer book. Some of the rooms that you'll see here are really badly deteriorated, like this one. And the thing that I like to point out with this picture is if you were to go across the hallway from this room, you would see that if you put new sheets on the bed over there, you might not be able to tell it from any other hotel room. It was in that good of condition. So why is it that you'd have, one side of the hall is in next to mint condition and the other side of the hall looks like it's been in the bottom of the ocean for a century? The reason is because the roof is going on one side of the building. Water really just erases buildings. It's pretty amazing. So when you're talking about decay, one of the thing that stands out to me in this picture is you have a room that's really deteriorating here. You have a television that is not, plastic does not degrade. It just is not. That whole thing could fall in and that TV may be broken into pieces, but those pieces will not be rotting into the earth. I am an architectural photographer by trade. The reason that I tell you that, one of the things about architectural photographers is that we're a very fussy perfectionist lot. Everything should be in focus, everything should be exposed properly. All your lines should be straight. Your horizontal and vertical lines should be straight. The reason that I point that out in this picture is so that when you look at this, you can see that that's not just me being sloppy. That staircase really is that crooked. And it really was kind of a scary staircase to go up. It did not get any more reassuring the higher I went. That is another resort that I was at in Lancaster. That's gone now. There are 2 chimneys from it, and that's all that's left. Churches. I've been to quite a few churches. I've actually heard that the basement of this one was a meth lab. I'm glad that I did not find that when I went there. Interesting thing is, too, that everybody always asks me, or when they look at the pictures, they'll say, oh, I see a face in that doorway over there or something. I never see these things. This is one of the few that I do. If you look up here, it's Darth Vader. So this church has actually only been abandoned for about 5 years, but the water damage is really bad in it. In fact, in the 1 or 3 years since it's been since I was at this church, it's got exponentially worse. Again, that's water just raises buildings. This church, on the other hand, has been abandoned for probably about 40 or 50 years, and the roof is intact. So that's why it's still in that good of condition, which is really nice because up here you have all these gorgeous hand-painted panels up there. I mean, you can see that somebody is sweeping it out and maintaining it, but it has been, about 40 or 50 years since they've actually held any services in it. This church, cathedral actually, the thing that kind of was very surreal about this was there was a small fire that happened in the inside of it. Didn't really do any structural damage, but it blasted the interior of the church with soot. So you have already a dark building, and then it's blackened. So you can see a little bit of the pastel yellow, but aside from that, it's very weird being in this huge cathedral that's just kind of nightmare black. That is the Church of the Transfiguration in Philadelphia, I should say it was. Fun story about this one is that, so basically, there's a guy named Raffaello Falieri. Raffaello Falieri was a con man who was running what was called the Vatican scandal, or scheme, where basically what he did was he convinced investors that he had ins in the Catholic Church, and he was going to get all of these churches for a really cheap price, and then he was going to fix them up into student housing and senior care, and he was going to give insurance to people who were uninsured. And then he proceeded to take that money and instead live the high life with his girlfriend at the time, Anne Hathaway, actress Anne Hathaway. So anyway, he wasn't offering competitive prices on churches. He really only secured 3, and this was one of those 3. So when he went to jail for stealing millions of dollars, which he did, this church was promptly destroyed for a school that never materialized. It is now, still years after it was torn down in, I think, 2008, a trash-strewn vacant lot in Philadelphia. And Falieri, for his part, for stealing millions of dollars, got like 4 years in prison. So he's out already, but I guess he's pretty sorry about it, right? So anyway, very sad though, because the people that were in this parish and that this neighborhood, the church was really important to them. So when they were tearing it down, there were actually people going through the rubble to take pieces of the building to put in their garden, so they still had a part of it. And that gives you just a little bit of an idea of the how beautiful it was. It was actually in very good condition. It was a very savable church compared to some. This church is also in the Philadelphia area. We have a lot of ailing churches, unfortunately. There are a lot that are being lost. And I could tell you a lot of stories about this one too. But anyway, suffice to say, it has 9 lives. I'm surprised it's still around. This church, on the other hand, is in the Pittsburgh area and has been abandoned for quite some time. Actually, pretty recently, that whole middle section collapsed. And when I say recently, I mean about a month ago. They actually had to evacuate part of the neighborhood because they were worried about the front half of the building just falling over and collapsing onto the houses. I've been to whole neighborhoods that have just block after block of abandoned buildings. This one in particular, when I went back to photograph this maybe a year or 2 ago, all the walls had sort of peeled out like petals of a flower, so it was just the chimney sticking up in the middle. And people often think that, houses are time capsules, but quite frequently people come in and dump their garbage in houses, their old tires in the kitchen, stuff like that. This is Long Beach, Connecticut, and this is one of the chapters in my newer book, a particularly sad story. Basically what happened in Long Beach was you have this peninsula, and it's connected to land in Stratford, and on the other end, in Bridgeport, there's a bridge that the people, was really the only connection to the community, because in the Stratford end, it was just all beach, like a sandbar. And you have these vacation homes, and they're owned by people that were retired teachers and factory workers. It's not like people on their 8th home or anything, they're people that were basically leasing the land, and their family had built these cottages themselves on it. So what happened in this community was that the bridge burnt, and Bridgeport said, we're not going to build another bridge. Stratford said, we're not going to let you build a road out here. So you had these people that now had these homes in a community where the only way to get to them was either boating to a rickety old dock or walking the better part of a mile along a sandbar. Really, I talked to some of the people that had lived there, and there were really some heartbreaking stories, like, for example, this one girl who was, walking with their family out to the houses and taking wagons and pulling as much as they could and get them back. But we all like to think that if the electricity goes out or, the power fails in our community, that somebody's going to come and fix it, and this is a great example of what happens when it doesn't. Schools. Because you have a great projector, I'm going to keep going on about that because you don't even know. I like to show people stuff in these pictures, and I can't always. You can see right there, there's the multiplication table still on the board. This school is Shenley, the Shenley High School in Pittsburgh, and this was the most expensive public school ever built, at a point where building high schools was really kind of a new and controversial investment in the public. This was actually also Andy Warhol's alma mater, and the first public school to cost over $1 million. It has a triangular shape, which is why it has that kind of battleship prow look to it. That's not Photoshop trickery. And I'm going to skip through a few of these. They actually had a new gym that was built just before it closed. This is a girls' school that I photographed. That's a boys' school. You can see that that was actually a pretty opulent and prestigious school. I think at this point, even though it's kind of in pretty bad condition now, the thing that's sad about this is the theater up at the top of the stairs. The thing that's kind of sad about this is that I had put off going back to photograph it for a long time because I really wasn't happy with my pictures. So finally I said, okay, you know what, I'll go back and I'll do it, which is where these pictures came from. And some kids set it on fire about a month later. So that building is gone, as are many. This has been torn down as well. That's a pediatric ward in a hospital. One of the things you'll see here is that this building had been on fire before too. That's why you have these kind of nightmare streaks in the soot. That's from the water kind of coming down. It's a pretty interesting patterns. Some of the buildings that I go to are in really good condition. If you're eagle-eyed, you could maybe notice that up there the plaster is peeling. But other than that, you could reopen that, but it is an abandoned school. And some of them are in quite bad condition. I have been to a number of prisons. I always think it's fun to be able to stand up in front of a large crowd of people and say that and not have to feel embarrassed of the fact. So this prison is Holmesburg in Philadelphia. And Holmesburg was one of the worst prisons in Philadelphia. And there are a lot of horror stories I could tell you about it if I had the time. But basically it had a long history of all the sorts of riots and murders and other things that you might expect in a really bad prison, but also had a lot of, basically unethical medical testing on the prisoners that were done by, Dow, Johnson & Johnson, the U.S. Army, and a number of other companies. That's one of the other many prisons that I've been to. That one, the thing that is kind of crazy about that is there were a lot of squatters living in this prison, and that's not something that happens in every place. Like, you might see the things that they have left behind in the buildings, but you don't necessarily run into them, especially not to the degree that you didn't hear. I mean, there were a lot of people living in this building, and so when you're in an abandoned building, your senses are kind of heightened a bit. So even for me, and I've been in hundreds of them, you know, there's a branch brushing against the window, or a pigeon flutters, and you go, oh, what's that? You know, and in this one, you'd see a shadow out of the corner of your eye, and look over, and you're like, oh, that's a dude. And he's just standing over there watching me, and then he'd kind of meld off into the shadows, and you know, 10 minutes later, you'd see somebody else in a completely different area of the building watching you as well. Really creepy. This prison is very modern, as you can see. I don't know if any of you are aware there are people on the internet that like to argue over dumb things. But this, being one of them, people will look at this and they will say, the lights are on, that's not abandoned. Like, I just asked everybody to be polite and move out of the picture or something, you know. This has been very recently closed. It's in mint condition. It will not reopen, more than likely. This is Baltimore Gas and Electric's Westport Generating Station. It was where the gas company in Baltimore consolidated all of their gas and electric into one building, which was the largest reinforced concrete building in the world when it was built. Why did they use reinforced concrete? Because if something blew up or caught fire, that would be better than wood, right? This also was just, I mean, power plants are stunning buildings. Most people don't get to see power water plants, but they're amazing. It's kind of interesting how they sort of squandered this grand architecture on these buildings the public can't go in. This had 3 of these turbine halls, and one of the neatest surprises I think I've ever seen in a building, a narrow gauge railroad at the top of the building. This would take the coal from the conveyors around to the furnaces at the top of the building. It was definitely not something that I really expected to see when I went up there. This is the Frank R. Phillips power station that was just south of Pittsburgh. That's been torn down. It was actually a pretty recent power plant. One of the things that I really kind of you know, come back to a lot is the fact that when we build a building, we do it with a purpose, right? You build a power plant because you want to give power to an area. You build a factory because you're going to manufacture a thing there. When a place is abandoned, it also has a meaning too. It means something about the community when it's torn down. So in this particular case, this power plant was built to generate electricity for all of the wartime industries that were along the you know, the river in that area. So when the industry started to go under, there wasn't a need for the power plant, and then eventually they tore it down. And that has a meaning too, in a way. I mean, I think, doesn't that kind of say, well, I guess we're not going to have industries of that scale in this area? It's kind of an admission of defeat in a way. This was the turbine hall inside there. The scale of these buildings is just unbelievable. And you can see they closed around Christmas, as often places do. Merry Christmas, workers. I'm going to skip through some of these power plants. This is the Ellis Island Communicable Disease Hospital. If any of you have ever been to Ellis Island, it is shaped like a U. It used to be that the whole thing was abandoned. Then Lee Iacocca came in I think it was the 80s, and rehabilitated one of the abandoned buildings into what is currently the Immigration Museum. That's on one side of the island. In the center of the island were the buildings where the immigrants first came in, were processed. And on the far side of the island was the Communicable Disease Hospital, where if you had, you know, rubella or scarlet fever or whatever, they would quarantine you at that hospital if they didn't send you back home and treat you. And actually, I mean, all things considered, it was a really progressive, good hospital. You got good care there, which is, you know, we like to think everybody in the past are barbarians, but if you didn't survive, you'd probably wind up here. This is the autopsy theater. And doctors would come from all around to watch autopsies of people because you would see all sorts of exotic diseases that they were unfamiliar with at the time. Speaking of diseases, this is the hospital where they cured tuberculosis. Now, if you have some of those people who like to debate things out there, somebody might say, there's multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis out there. Yes, there is. That is still a serious threat. Tuberculosis has not been completely eradicated, but this hospital is the reason why like 1 in 5 people that you know have not died of tuberculosis. The tuberculosis killed off billions of people since prehistoric times, and this is the one that successfully treated it. And because it was so successful in treating it, it kind of put itself out of business. So if you think about, you know, like if there was a hospital that cured cancer, and I mean all the various forms of it, you know, And then, the public pretty much said, okay, well, good job, guys, you're closed now, and we're going to just let you fall apart. That's essentially what happened here. This is a pediatrics ward at a different hospital. I've been to theaters, many theaters. I have actually quite a few of those too. This is the Victory Theater in Holyoke, Massachusetts. It was actually one of 7 theaters in the town when the mills closed. It went from being a very prosperous town to being one of the poorest in the U.S. And so even though the whole urban renewal period of knocking down buildings passed over it because they didn't have any money, there were a lot of people that were setting buildings on fire for insurance. So none of the theaters are left except for this one. They're really hoping that they can rehabilitate this one to draw people back into the downtown, which actually isn't as crazy of an idea as you might think, but that's for a longer discussion on this particular place. This is a motorcycle graveyard, essentially. The guy had a motorcycle salvage and repair shop and hoarded hundreds of bikes. I was kind of fully expecting to go through the floor and have some of these heavy bikes fall on top of me. At this place, as you can see, the floor is in really bad condition. This is an Elks Lodge. I was just admiring the Elks Lodge in your town today. I hope if any of you get a chance, you go and take a look at it and see if you can talk them into seeing the interior, because they're neat buildings. This was a very cool building. I didn't really know what Elks Lodges were all about until I went to this one and started researching it. Apparently that was the sort of social club for vaudeville actors and whatnot. And if you don't know any vaudeville actors, that may be why there aren't very many Elks Lodges left. Thing about this building was, this was a dumb luck find. I usually find things via either research, networking, or dumb luck, and dumb luck is probably the least likely one. I was photographing something else in the area. I saw this building. The whole place was wide open, so I went inside, and it was very dark and creepy. This room is actually a lot darker than that. I brightened it up so you could see it. And basically, when I made it up to the top and I was looking in this room, and all of this is in shadows. All I can see is this little shaft of sunlight coming through the ceiling over there, and I'm like, what is that? What is that on the far wall being, like God himself is highlighting it, so I should look at it. And I walked across the room and I realized it was an old, rotting, taxidermied elk head. And just as I was kind of realizing that and how creepy that was, my foot went through the floor, so I did what any sane person would do and stayed for the rest of the day and photographed it. This is AMARG, the Aerospace Maintenance and Reclamation Group in Tucson, Arizona. This is where all of the aircraft from all of the branches of service are retired. It is an active facility. It is very active. If you go there and try and do, there's this movie Can't Buy Me Love where they sneak in there, it'll be bad, because there will be people with, rifles that will ask you what you're doing there. This was a fantastic day, though, for me to get to see these. These are C-5 Galaxies, these planes. I think they call them that because that's about how big they are. They're enormous. So this is the do as I say, not as I do part. Like to kind of go over what the risks are of these buildings and why I'm such a foolish person for going inside them. There's a hint. So these buildings can really be in terrible condition. And the thing that you have to worry about is floors, for the most part. To get this picture, by the way, I had to go from that doorway to that floor. It was actually one of the scariest moments of my life until I had to go from that floor back to that doorway. That down there is like a punji pit in the basement. I'm kind of surprised there's not photographer skeletons all over it, because there really should be. So this is another hospital that I went to, and you can see the whole collapsing floors thing is really a big deal. One of the things about floors in these older buildings is they use this tongue and groove system where you can kind of see along the wall where the boards would fit in. Moisture collects at the head of those boards and then rots the ends off. So when the floor collapses, what you should see in this is it didn't do it in stages. That whole thing fell at once. If you were standing on that thing, you might see that maybe the floor was about 6 inches below where it should be along the wall. But if you weren't really paying attention because, I don't know, say you're ghost hunting at night and you're not looking at the wall, you might not even notice that until that drops you, down a floor and then pancakes another and then you're dead. Ceilings also are bad. The thing about this picture, I was up on the catwalk taking this photograph, and a large chunk of plaster and concrete fell. This is a power plant. That's about 180 feet right there, and it just tumbled end over end and crashed on the railing and broke in half, and more of it fell into the basement and crashed again. And the thing that struck me, thankfully not literally, was the fact that it made no noise when it fell out of the ceiling. You would think a big chunk of plaster and concrete falls out, it'd be like, oh hey, I'm coming down. You know, it doesn't do that. If I were on that turbine hall floor, I would have been smashed like a bug and had no idea. This one is kind of a grab bag. So a lot of people know about asbestos, which was something that they used in a lot of older buildings to as a fire retardant, you know. But there are a lot of other fun things, particularly in industrial buildings, that can really hurt you pretty bad. So one of the things that you'd see in this picture is lead paint. Lead paint looks delicious. Actually, I've heard it is. That's why kids ate it, you know. But the thing is that causes all sorts of brain damage and other health problems. So even if you're one of the smart people and you say, oh, you know, you look really tasty, lead paint, but I'm not going to eat you, you're still going to breathe it when it's crushed up and atomized in the air and you're walking around knocking it up into the air. The other thing, and I want, you know, maybe you can think about this, is, so look at how big that is. I mean, you're not really able to read that. That's much bigger than the actual sticker was. What that sticker says is that this thing is full of mercury, also something that causes a whole heap of neurological problems. So this place was a dye factory. I don't know what was going on there, but signs usually don't have fur. Yeah, it's kind of a bad sign, I think, literally. That is the prison that I was telling you about, where the people were living in the cells. Was actually really heartbreaking too, because no matter how you feel about crime or, you know, the lifestyle choices people have made, I think being in a rusty, falling apart prison in the middle of winter when it's just freezing cold out is a fate that really nobody should have to endure. But, you know, right across on the bars, you could really see why. So that's, I guess, the anti-drug PSA for the night. This place is kind of shows some of the random things that you might not think about. This power plant, you can see that says 2400 volts. You can see there's puddles of water on the floor. Power wasn't on in sections of the building, so it's kind of, you know, a bit of a guess, isn't it, if you step into that pool. And the biggest thing that everybody knows is like the huge danger of abandoned buildings is ghosts.
Is that you?
No, that's my friend. My friend the ghost. So I don't really tell people where some of these buildings are for a number of reasons. One of them is I don't want you to go get hurt. One of the reasons is that people are just atrociously destructive creatures. So this particular place was one of my favorite places. I went back there for about 5 years. It got internet famous about 2 years ago. People went in and broke the windows and spray painted all over these cars, and they ripped out the floors to get at the copper wiring beneath it, which then rotted out the floors, which meant the cars sank onto them. They cut out the electrical boxes beneath them, and this place looks like garbage now. It's still an interesting area, but the point is that, you know, people really trash these places. So if you happen to find a really interesting place, if you want it to get destroyed, then putting it on the internet is, you know, the way to go, and telling everybody where it is. So the way that I got into this was I worked in mental health, and I got really interested. I was in adult inpatient care, and I got really interested in the history of the asylums and what their background was. And there was one that, I mean, obviously the history of the asylums is pretty dark, and there's one that I heard about again and again that was in the Philadelphia area known as Philadelphia State Hospital, or Byberry. There were people that I worked with that had worked there or had been patients there. And this place had been closed about 10 years at this point. So anyway, I kept reading about it and thinking, you know what, I'd really like to go and see this place myself. So, and this is a long story that if I had more time I would love to tell you about, because it's kind of a funny story, but anyway, I went and I saw the place, and it's, you know, 160 acres, it's 40 odd buildings, miles of underground tunnels. I was not a photographer at this point. This is why you're looking at an aerial photograph and not the building, you know. And I tried to tell people about what made this magical and what made this a really special experience, and why I thought it was important to know about this building, which I might add had a photo expose that was done in the 1940s of the conditions in the wards, which, and I can say this without hyperbole, if you shuffled them up with pictures of concentration camps, you wouldn't be able to entirely guess correctly which was which. That was how bad the conditions in this place were. So anyway, I could tell people about how going through these underground tunnels and coming up through the ruins of an old boiler room into an overgrown courtyard with burnout buildings and wild turkeys running around was such an unbelievable experience. But, I think they really thought that I was kind of crazy. But if you can show people what makes a building special, this is a different hospital. This is the one that had those really bad floors that I'd shown you earlier. I could have told you that the floors were bad. I could tell you that this is a beautiful example of high Victorian architecture and that the wings span a half mile from tip to tip and that this had a 7-alarm fire and, I could tell you all about this, but, it's not going to mean as much unless you see it. And the thing that was really important about that to me is the fact that these places were really important to the communities they were in. They made postcards of their institutions and asylums. We look at these places as houses of horrors, because that's kind of the end of history that we're on. But when they were built to care for the less fortunate, people that were in prisons and poorhouses and in the streets and relatives' attics. That's why they campaigned to build these, and the towns that built these places petitioned to have them. They were proud of them, So what went wrong? There were a lot of things that went wrong. This is Pilgrim State Hospital in Long Island. It was at one point the largest mental health facility in the world. It had 40,000 people, over 40,000 people when you counted the staff and the patients that were there. That's larger than many small towns. This is the medical surgical building. I actually was in the room where they performed supposedly over 2,000 lobotomies, the operating room. We have that kind of the haunted house thing, and I'm not really helping it considering that this is taken at night and it's all creepy looking. But there are a lot of ordinary things in these places too that are vanishing. You have this little hair salon where, I think in some ways these things show that they're real people that were in them. It's not just the spooky haunted house, American Horror Story sort of thing. It's a place where maybe your aunt was or your grandfather, people were committed to these large facilities for tons of reasons that, would just blow your mind at this point. Anything from being homosexual to being too outspoken as a woman, being too effeminate as a guy. Maybe your brother wants your land or your husband wants to divorce you. Or, there was one case where a guy was a Turkish immigrant and people just didn't understand Turkish, so they thought he was speaking gibberish and they put him in an asylum for the rest of his life. This is something that really affected a lot of people, and as these places get torn down, the ability to connect with them and understand them vanishes too, right? But there's a flip side to it. It's not just, a one-sided story about how awful people in the past were. These were real people that thought these were a good idea too. And they put a lot of time and effort into the buildings. They were beautiful buildings. You don't build a theater like that in a place where you're just throwing people out, right? That was something that happened later. That was a failure that people had later. And I hate to tell you, but the whole, issues of underfunding, overcrowding, understaffing are still very real problems in communities. It's community health facilities. If you have a relative or a friend who needs mental health care, it's still really hard to get it, We're kind of back to the prisons and poorhouses and streets and relatives' attics model. In the meanwhile, we're letting these buildings fall apart through demolition by neglect, essentially. And the idea of the stories that they have and the reality that they have is kind of vanishing. And again, I think there's a very real beauty to the buildings too that goes beyond just the kind of the stories that are in it. This is gorgeous architecture. The last I saw of this particular hallway was a photograph somebody else had taken where it was on its side in a field of rubble as they tore down this particular hospital. So that's, I guess, when I say I feel that the stories are important, these are things that don't just belong to the hospitals or the people that were in them. They're part of everybody's story. They're a part of all of our past, and I think that's why they're important to look at and share. So I am going to, because of time, skip through this. Giovanni Battista Piranesi, a great artist. If you ever get a chance, go see his work. One of my inspirations, godfather kind of ruins and etchings before cameras were even a thing. This is his student Hubert Robert that was came from France to study under him and then went back up to France and was enormously successful with paintings of ruins. This is Clarence John Laughlin, who is a photographer in the American South who did a lot of plantation buildings and places like that in the earlier part of the century where, a lot of these are now gone. Really did gorgeous pictures of them. This is Richard Nickel, who photographed a lot of the buildings in Chicago when they were destroying these unbelievably grand buildings. A lot of Louis Sullivan's masterpieces, were torn down at this point. And Nickel not only went and photographed the buildings, he also advocated for preservation, got a lot of preservation laws passed. He also died when the floor of the old Chicago Stock Exchange collapsed underneath him, and he was there for, I think it was 28 days. So you really hope that he died on day one, because if not, oh man. So anyway, the point of this is that I think, all of us see tons of images every day, right? I mean, you're just bombed with them on your phone and the internet and television. And I think there's a point where they become kind of meaningless. We just consume them idly, like Cheetos. And the thing is that when you look at these sorts of pictures, you can say, okay, well, that's there is an aesthetic interest to decay. I totally get that. I mean, there's something really compelling about it. But I also think that when you look at things like this, you can't just view them as something that's an idle form of entertainment. You're viewing other people's losses and catastrophes, I mean, if a tornado came in and hit your town, you wouldn't want people to just gawk at the destruction that it had left behind. In this particular case, this is a textile mill in Pennsylvania, and, the loss of it really just destroyed the town. I mean, it's an impoverished area now, and many of the people are moving out because the tentpole industry got kicked out. When you look at places like hospitals and institutions and asylums, I think the question should be, what are we replacing this with? Or do we have something that's better than them? What are we doing for people that are less fortunate now? You look at churches, and even if you're not a person of faith, these are buildings that a lot of work and effort went into that meant quite a bit to quite a few people. So you have, say, for example, German or Polish immigrants that came in and they brought the trades and crafts of their communities. They saved up all their pennies so that they could build these cathedrals that were supposed to rival the ones in Europe and stand the test of time. And less than a century later, they're being left to fall apart and being torn down, and they're made of materials and craftsmanship that cannot and will not ever be recreated. Mark my words, they just don't have the things to build like that anymore. Building codes are different. Schools. I think schools are probably one of the most upsetting ones to me because they represent the commitment to the public to help us. Everybody has a different idea of what the American dream is, but the definition of it that is agreed on for that phrase is that you can rise above your station in life, right? You can, your dad can be a shoe polisher and you can grow up and own the shoe company because, you worked hard. And because you really, and education is one of the rungs of those ladders that is so important. So when you take a community like this, an inner city school that was a prestigious school that people like Babe Ruth and Amelia Earhart and Albert Einstein and Herbert Hoover all came and spoke at, and then you let it fall apart, and then you bulldoze it, and you build a parking lot and a dollar store in its place in an area that is really struggling with schools. That is really struggling with its education. And this is something that's not just local to Philadelphia. I mean, this is something that American urban areas across the U.S. are struggling with, is funding is just really challenging, and education is something that, consistently gets cut. This is the before of the auditorium of this school, which if you could squint, and you can't, but if you could see right up there, there are like the kids' sneakers, and there's the I had a dream speech. by Martin Luther King Jr. Typed up that somebody had read in their last graduating class. And then that says they were demolishing the building. You know, that says a lot about us as a people. These places reflect us. They reflect us when they're built, and they reflect us when they're torn down. And I think that in places like this, Long Beach, which I mentioned to you earlier and told you the story of, I think there's very important warnings for all of us too, because we all think it's not going to be us, right? We all think that this will never be where we live. So the important thing, I think, is, you know, we have this aversion to failure and to catastrophe. We want to look at the sort of happy things, but I feel like, you know, really looking at these communities and what happened to them is important to all of us so that we can learn from it. So anyway, to end on a completely not completely doom and gloom note, when I finished my master's degree at Rochester Institute of Technology, I was kind of at a point where I was like, oh my God, student loans, you know, what am I going to do? So I was trying to think of what I was going to, how I was going to move forward from this and what I wanted to do with my life, and it kind of fell on my lap, not this shit, but you know, basically, I started teaching photography workshops at some of these places. So this is the SS United States. It was the largest ocean liner ever built on American soil, and also the fastest ocean liner ever built, period. Supposed to go about 44 miles an hour, roughly, this thing. It's also about 100 feet larger than the Titanic, and I worked with the conservancy that has it, and we had workshops there. It's a business. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I'm not a nonprofit group, but a lot of that money goes back to these places. Now, in a case like this, they have such astronomical operating costs that the like $3,000 or $4,000 that I raised for them is nothing. You know, I mean, it really isn't. But some of the places, it can really help. Like, you know, this is Kerry Furnaces in Pittsburgh, used to be part of Homestead Steel, which was at a time the largest steel manufacturer in the United States. And so I work with these groups and kind of get people legit access into some of these places where they're not going to fall to their death, you know, and where I have actual cooperation with the people that own it, and, you know, they can kind of come in and appreciate them. This is Bethlehem Steel. Those are the old fire trucks for the steel plant. It's a lot of fun and something that I really enjoy doing, and yeah, like I said, at this point, I think this year I passed the 100,000 mark in terms of the amount that was paid out to these places. So, you know, and another thing that I should, you know, really point out in the interest of honesty is, like in Scranton Lace's case, they're not really doing anything to save these buildings. I wish they were. You know, I can't mandate that people take the money that they're paid to go and fix up the property, so that doesn't happen all the time, but at least, you know, a bunch of photographers have got in to really document the building about as thoroughly as any place ever could be before it's torn down. So, oh, and this Mariah Cemetery in Philadelphia, that's also a really interesting story, where basically what happened was the cemetery was abandoned, and the community came together and started to clean it up and put the records back together, so that people who would, you know, say your grandmother passed away and was buried there, and then the whole place became a forest. I mean, literally a forest filled with tombstones that nobody knows where anybody is, and her grave might be completely grown over in the weeds. They would help you clear to that, they would clear to that area and then help you find out where she was. So they're really cool people. I'm really proud to work with them, and I love the work that they do. So anyway, I think with that, these are just some of the other places that I've had them at, and I'm going to skip through a bit because I would like to get us to the portion where we have the Q&A, and I'm actually running on schedule. So I'm Matthew Christopher. This is, you know, my series Abandoned America. If you get a chance, if you buy my book and you do like it, leave a review on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, please. I hate to plug and beg, but you know, that really is an enormous help for smaller authors. With that, thank you so much for coming. It really has been a pleasure speaking with you tonight. So, I'm not gonna lie, there have been some of the places, particularly like the asylums or whatever, for example, that one that I was talking about that was in really bad condition. I mean, nobody in their right mind is gonna let you go into that building, but it also is pretty well left open. So, but I do prefer permission, and that is kind of the route that I go most of the time at this point. There really aren't, the whole aspect of use of images in places that are kind of off limits like that is very nebulous at this point. It's not something that there's really been sort of legal precedence set on. So to answer your question, I mean, yes, you know, it is something that you absolutely have to be careful about because very bad things can happen. I mean, you can get hurt, you can get arrested. That was one of the things that I should have mentioned when I was talking about issues that you can run into going into the places. So I would never recommend, first of all, I don't really recommend going into them, period, but especially not without permission. So, yeah, any other questions?
Sure do. Do you wear any type of protective gear when entering these buildings? And I imagine you would want to at least cover your face, right?
So there's the responsible answer and there's my answer, right? So the responsible answer is yes, wear protective gear, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of airborne particles in the buildings and things that are bad for you, as I was mentioning earlier. Me, I'm not going to live forever. At this point, I am, you know, I have probably breathed in so many bad things in these buildings that I don't know, maybe I'll get superpowers from it one day. Isn't that what usually happens? I mean, I photographed an asbestos factory after it was, right,
Was
so.
that the growing sign?
What's that?
I said, was that the growing sign? The asbestos, the sign that was growing?
Oh, no, asbestos, I didn't have any pictures of asbestos. Asbestos is just a white stuff that you'd find in the walls like insulation. In fact, fun asbestos fact that I bet you didn't think I was full of fun asbestos facts, but they used to, like in the 30s and 40s, if you'd watch a movie where they were like, hey, it's a winter wonderland, throwing snow everywhere, that was often asbestos. They didn't know they caused cancer, you know. Merry Christmas, kids. But anyway, there have been places where I've had to wear masks. There was one place that I had to wear a full-body Tyvek suit to go into. It was in the middle of summer. It was not all that fun. I recommend it for people, particularly like if I have workshops or whatever, I kind of mandate that at this point. But is it something that I have been entirely responsible with myself? I would be a liar if I said yes. So, yes?
Is there much in the way of when they start to tear those buildings down that they recover, or some things like some of those churches have beautiful stained glass windows? Do they try to salvage those, or does the guy just come in and tear the whole thing down, throw it in a truck and haul it to the dump?
It's a bit of some, a bit of the other. So the question, did everybody hear the question? The question was if things got salvaged or not. Yeah, there are a lot of salvage companies, and that's actually some of the people that will get me into places are friends that I have and contacts that I've made in salvage companies. The thing about that is, though, that when you look at it from a demolition contractor viewpoint or a property owner viewpoint, like, let's say that you have a beautiful old church, and you finally get permission from the zoning board to tear it down. You want to knock that thing down quick, because you don't want there to be some, you know, community-mounted preservation effort. You want to just kick it to the ground as fast as you can. If you're a demolition company, you don't really want to take the time to have salvage companies go through, because that's time that's keeping you from your next job. So usually people that are in salvage companies are often, you know, maybe they have a friend or two that's there, they still will throw the money, but they're working against the clock too. And the clock is not necessarily waiting for them, because the amount of money that they can throw at a demolition contractor is going to be nothing compared to the amount of money that they're going to get to actually tear the building down. Any other questions? Yes?
What was the building you were most scared to enter?
So, the building that I was most scared to enter, I'm gonna say it was that one with the really bad floors. I just went back there, and I've been in a number with really bad floors. So there have been a lot of places that, and that's the thing that scares me. I've been in places that are very creepy and atmospheric, but falling through the floor sort of is the trump card of, you know, scary things to me. And in that particular one, I would say it was both very, very creepy, but also, you know, really dangerous, really, really dangerous. If you were to ask, let's put aside the safety element of things. One of the places that was creepiest to me was one of the ones that's in my second book. It was an institution for kids and adults with physical and developmental disabilities. And it was a place that really was just horrific in how they cared for them. I mean, like, it was so bad that I couldn't even fit all the bad things in the chapter. And so I could give you a lot of stories about how awful it was and how unfortunately poorly the people that were treated there. But the thing that really sort of hit it home with me, and there were a lot of various stories that I could tell you about, just awful and creepy things that I found there that kind of really, you know, nailed in the fact that this was a very bad place. But the one point was when I was in the morgue, and you know, the drop ceiling had kind of fallen in. It was like this schmoo on the floor of just dirt and drop ceiling and whatever. And like a little pair of glasses by my foot. And then I saw another pair, and then I saw another pair, and there were a whole bunch of these little pairs of glasses, and it kind of slowly dawned on me as I was by myself in this kind of dark, creepy basement morgue. These are dead kids' glasses, you know? So if you're talking about, you know, the place that was just inherently the creepiest, that building and that place would probably be it. I mean, there were a lot of other things too. There were, you know, old records about improper dental care and how poor it was there for the people. There was, you know, one report about this girl who had, and I hope I don't butcher the pronunciation, hydroencephalus, which is where you have water on your brain, and she also had osteogenesis imperfecta, which is brittle bone syndrome. And so what that meant was that they had to keep her confined in a crib for her whole life, because if she left the crib, her bones would break. So, you know, they were talking about how she really wanted to go out and play with the other kids, and she just couldn't. And, you know, you think about something like that. And that, to me, those are the things that really are terrifying to me, or to think about what would it be like to be like that? What would it be like to be in a place like this facility if you had that? And how would you deal with that if you're somebody else? I mean, you know, if you're somebody who's a staff there, it's not like you can just magically make that better. That's just an awful, awful situation. So anyway, there's a depressing answer. Anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
Do you have a mission statement for the work that you do?
So, I mean, I think that would, you know, it would kind of depend on the day. There are a lot of facets to it that I think are really interesting to me, but the thing that I think maybe is kind of the most important to me is to be able to tell the stories and share the places, because that's the thing. I mean, like an asylum, for example, and not to relate everything back to them, but, or a power plant, they're not public spaces. They're not places that people get to see a lot of. And when they're torn down, it's kind of, you know, you don't have pictures while they were open, you don't have pictures while they were closed, they just vanished. It's just sort of I think the idea is being able to share these places with other people and hear what people's stories are and what their connections are to them. I mean, to me, the thing that makes me the happiest, it's not like I'm trying to be the rock star here. I like when I hear from somebody that says, you know, my aunt worked at this state hospital, or I worked at this state hospital, and this is what it was like. This is an anecdote. These are some of the people that I knew, things like that. Because, you know, that's kind of what I think democratizes history. History shouldn't necessarily just be, you know, the possession of one person, particularly when you're talking about things like factories or asylums or things like that that really affected thousands of lives in particular areas. So I'm always for preservation, either through actual physical preservation or, you know, documentation. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned that you went to revisited places, and they either were more deteriorated or they were maybe knocked down. Have you been to any that perhaps revitalized? And I say that along the lines of like Chelsea Piers in New York City, or even like McDermott Fieldhouse in Lindsay that took a vacant packing house that was vacant for 10 years, revitalized it into community center. Have you come across any of those sites?
Absolutely, and I really make an effort in the books to not just have places that have failed, The whole theme in my head of the second book is failure, but it's not just about, oh, okay, you know, everything went wrong and these places got torn down and, you know, we all die and life is terrible. That's not, the point is also trying to look at stories where people were successful or where they built on the ashes, you know. And so, you know, to answer your question, in the first book, one of the churches that I whizzed by at the end that, you know, the realtor even told me when I was going through it at first that he thought it was going to be a total loss. That got turned into a Waldorf school. And they kept all of the architectural features of the building, which was absolutely astonishing, you know. And the other thing, too, is that there are a lot of places that people wouldn't even know are or were endangered. The museum on Ellis Island is one of the examples that I like to use frequently with that. Or I gave a presentation at the Paramount Theater in Austin, Texas. And that is this, I mean, absolutely gorgeous theater. Like, it's one of the most beautiful theaters I've ever seen. That was abandoned for several years. The city was talking about turning it down, and then some people fought and, you know, brought it back. In fact, a lot of the theaters in Broadway, New York, were abandoned until people, you know, really started trying to fight to save them. And now that's something that generates billions of dollars every year and tons of, you know, tons and tons of jobs. So it's a huge part of their industry. So like a lot of the places you wouldn't even know were endangered. So yes, absolutely, I do look at that. I think like the second book, I have the two theaters, and that's about their struggle to be, you know, brought back to life. And the one that was in Cleveland, you know, they just erected the marquee in front of the building again, which I think is literally a huge sign that they're reinvesting in that neighborhood. So yeah, I do try and balance it out and give both sides of the story in that. Yes?
In your books, do you talk about the architects that actually did the original buildings? So do you study out the buildings when you do that?
I do. I try and find as much information as I can, all the interesting stories about them. So yeah, quite often I do have the architects that designed them and, you know, what their original ideas and plans were when they built them, wherever I can find that. I mean, I think the thing of it is that you want to find what gives the places life and spirit and, you know, makes them something that is compelling. And that's one thing that I'm really lucky about is that, you know, I have the opportunity to kind of go back and find all the crazy stories. I mean, you know, that institution I was telling you about earlier that was the creepiest place, you know, the way to end that on a not depressing note was they had, you know, at one point they had a beer drinking, trumpet playing rabbit that a magician had given to John F. Kennedy, and he promptly regifted it to this hospital. And, you know, anyway, that's obviously the rabbit was not the architect. But the point of this is that, you know, looking into the people who built it and the people who inhabited it and all these crazy little stories, yeah, that's the whole other end of things that I really work on in the books. So, yeah.
I'm just curious about a lot of this beauty from the past. We don't see it today. They built a courthouse or a school or a store. Where did that come from? How did they fund those things in the past? Is there any way we could ever do that again?
Well, okay, that's actually, I mean, that's a really good question, and I don't know. I mean, you're talking about things, for example, that were built with entirely different building styles. For example, when you know, reinforced steel beams came into effect, you didn't need buttresses and columns in a building anymore. So some of those things have become kind of outdated. Also, the stone that you might have had in those columns might have come from a local quarry that now has already been exhausted, or you know, the beams could have been old trees that, you know, that forest is already gone. So I think a lot of those materials are gone. But beyond that, you know, kind of more to the point, I think. If you look about a century ago, when they built the cathedral or a church house or a church or whatever, a courthouse, they were building it to, in essence, to compete with Europe and to show the sort of greatness of the country. And these were monuments that were going to be there for centuries to come. And we live in a very disposable culture. Our buildings are by and large made of garbage materials now because of cost and because of, you know, if you look at all the condos that are going up in Philly, they're made out of this pressed wood stuff that, you know, just melts if you get water on it. So I think, there's the sort of architecture of failure now where you plan for obsolescence. You plan that Applebee's is going to become a TGI Fridays when it goes out of business, and then maybe after that you're going to rip the steel out and tear it down. I think that, maybe the way to combat that, and I mean, the part about how you get to that point where it isn't like that is such a big question that, we could probably talk for an hour about that. But I think, investing in the communities and really investing in buildings that aren't disposable and treating places of substance like they aren't disposable, I think is important. I mean, it's not just building new buildings, it's also making sure that beautiful courthouse that you have is, and appreciating the buildings that you do have in your community that are great. So, I don't know if, do I have time for one more, or should I?
One last question.
Okay, you.
What's the most common situation that you find people abandon their buildings for, or is it more of a complex case-by-case basis?
It is a very complex case-by-case basis. I think that you have, so for example, I mean, if you have the state hospitals are abandoned because of anything from the use of psychotropic medication that, people can be treated in the communities with, to a push away from institutionalizing people. If you're talking about factories, one of the things that I think people on both sides of the political aisle can agree on is that many of them have been moved outside of the United States, and part of the reason for that is because we have these environmental laws and child labor laws and safety laws, and it's cheaper to skirt them. It's cheaper to put them in places where you don't have to have them. So, you put the clothing factory in a place where you can pay a kid $0.05 a day and a fire trap to make your shoes. And, that has had ripple effects on the communities. You don't have the money for the disposable income if people aren't working to fund a church or to fund a school, or to, really build civic infrastructure. So, I mean, I think that, in a lot of cases, I feel one of the root causes is deindustrialization. But yeah, I mean, it's a million different things for a million different places. And that, too, is part of what makes the places interesting, and each have their own unique story. So.
On that note,